Right, today I have for you Oversimplified's World War II Part 1. Looks like I'm starting part with the video, but I'm really just skipping a rather long ad. But let's go ahead and jump right in.
Learn something new today. Now, without further ado. It's 1902. A young man by the name of Benito Mussolini moves from Italy to Switzerland to avoid military service. He gets big into socialism, working for trade unions, writing for socialist newspapers, advocating a violent overthrow of European monarchies, the whole shebang. This gets him in a bit of trouble with the Swiss police, so he gets arrested, sent back to Italy, set free, returns to Switzerland, is arrested again, goes back to Italy again, completes his military service after previously avoiding it, and then after a brief stint as an elementary school teacher, he finally returns to work as an avid socialist. His speeches and journalistic abilities made him famous among Italian socialists. He was anti-war, so when Italy colonized Libya in 1910, he rioted and got arrested. Then World War I came along, and once again he protested Italy's involvement. But then he thought, wait a minute, this war could bring about the social climate needed to overthrow European monarchies and bring about the socialist revolution everywhere. And suddenly he was pro-war. But his fellow socialists didn't like his new pro-war stance, so they kicked him out of the party. So then he said, you know what? I'm done with socialism. We need something new, not based on class divisions tearing us apart, but based on unity through nationality. We'll conquer the Mediterranean and reunite all Italian peoples just like the days of the Roman Empire. I'll call it fascismo, and it will guide the Italian nation to greatness. That's all well and good, Mr. Mussolini, but what kind of haircut am I giving you? Let's go with bold. Italy had been on the winner's side in World War I, and they hoped they were going to get a lot out of it, but in the end they only got a little, and they felt cheated. On top of that, a bad economy and weak governments meant that the Italian people were a little unhappy. So when Mussolini came along and said that he could fix everything, his fascist movement gained a lot of support. In 1922, he went to the king and said, make me prime minister or I'll make me prime minister. And the king said, you and what army? This army. Fair enough. Then he went about establishing a dictatorship with himself at its center. Europe had its first fascist dictator. Next up, Germany. Germany had been on the loser's side, and they got absolutely wrecked by the Treaty of Versailles. They lost territory, had to demilitarize the Rhineland, had to reduce their army to just 100,000 men, couldn't have an air force, had to pay the Allies a huge amount of money that it didn't have, and a new rule was established that every Englishman withheld the right to walk into the center of Berlin, pick out any German they wanted, and spank the hell out of them. I made that last one up, but it helps you understand how all this felt to Germans. On top of that, a bad economy and weak governments meant that when a small angry man with a silly mustache came along and said that he could fix everything, the German people loved it. Hitler had been a soldier during World War I, and he was crazy patriotic, and nobody was madder than him about Germany's humiliation. He helped start a new political party, and in 1923 attempted a march on Munich with his boys. And then he got arrested. But his popularity grew, and in 1933, the president made him chancellor. He believed he was Germany's great destined savior, and he went full megalomaniac, establishing a dictatorship with himself at its center. Europe had fascist dictator number 2. Hitler and Mussolini had a lot of the same ideas, but more importantly, they had the same enemies, and they started to get along. Anyone else want to be friends? Franco? No? You good? I do. Who's that? It's Japan, and they've taken over northern China. Let's rewind a bit. Japan had isolated itself from the rest of the world for over 200 years until the Americans showed up and said, you're going to trade with us and you're going to like it. Then the Western powers imposed a bunch of unequal treaties, meaning Japan's economy was bust. They also had no natural resources, so they decided to go get some. They went to war with China to gain a sphere of influence over Korea, and they took a bunch of China's stuff. But then the West said, hey, cut that out. And since Japan couldn't take on the West, they said, okay, I guess we'll just go home. Wait a minute, what are you doing? Taking advantage of a weakened China and setting up spheres of influence. But I was the one who weakened them. We know. And you guys didn't let me have anything. We know. That seems unfair. We don't think so. Okay, see ya. So Japan thought, screw this, and went to war with Russia, and stunned everyone by actually winning. Then they fully annexed Korea, but they didn't stop there. In World War I, they took Germany's colonies and islands in Asia. And then in an incident that was maybe staged by the Japanese army, a bomb blew up a Japanese train in Manchuria, giving them an excuse to launch an invasion and take over. So here's the situation. Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Japan all believe they're racially superior, all feel hostility towards the Allies, and all want to militarize and take over more stuff. And so they did. Let's start with Germany. Hitler hated the Treaty of Versailles, and now he was ready to begin undoing it. In complete violation of the treaty, the first Luftwaffe squadrons were set up, conscription was introduced, and he pimped up his army. The Allies did nothing. Then Hitler sent his army back into the demilitarized Rhineland, giving orders to immediately retreat if the Allies showed up. The Allies did nothing. With his military re-strengthened, he could now move on to step 2. He wanted to rapidly increase the Aryan population, and to do so, he needed Lebensraum, or in other words, he would have to take over the world. But for now, a good portion of Europe would do, and he began eyeing up his neighbors. The Allies finally started to get worried, so they implemented a fairly useless diplomatic strategy called appeasement, and it went a little something like this. Hitler would say, "I want that thing," and the Allies would say, "You can't have that thing." "Okay, you can have that thing, but no more." "I want that thing." And repeat. In 1938, Hitler's army marched into Austria and just took it, with no resistance. Boom, this is Germany now. Next, he demanded to be given the Sudetenland, an area of Czechoslovakia with many ethnic Germans. The Allies held a meeting with Hitler in Munich and said, "Look, we're gonna give you what— Hang on, this meeting is about my territory, shouldn't I come to the meeting too?" "Anyway, we're gonna give you what you want." "Really?" "Yeah." "Just like that?" "Yep." "What's the catch?" "Just sign this piece of paper promising you won't invade the rest of Czechoslovakia." "Okay." Then Chamberlain returned home victorious, waving his signed piece of paper in the air, declared—
Yeah, Chamberlain was such a pushover. Oh my god. You really thought that was going to work. That's really what happened. This is just like, yeah, you can totally have this as long as you don't take the rest of it. You know, just don't go after Poland, don't go after other places. And Hitler's like, okay. Because the longer they waited, the stronger Hitler's army became. So it's kind of like, all right, I get this stuff, and I just have to like wait a little longer before I take it. It's actually not a pretty bad deal, you know. Oh, Chamberlain, you useless sack of crap.
declaring crisis to be averted and the continuation of world peace, and we built a statue of Chamberlain in his honor, and every day on the 30th of September we celebrate Chamberlain Day. Hitler's invading the rest of Czechoslovakia. What? He's invading the rest of Czechoslovakia. Oh. You lied to me. What do you expect? I'm Hitler. Not to be outdone, Mussolini also wanted to get in on the action. He thought to himself, isn't there a not yet colonized nation somewhere which is so underdeveloped that the people would be defending themselves against our tanks with literal bows and arrows and wooden spears? Oh, there is? Fantastic. And so he took it. Italy also wanted to control the entrance to the Adriatic Sea, so they occupied Albania. Then, in another incident which was maybe staged by the Japanese, gunfire was exchanged by Japanese and Chinese troops at the Marco Polo Bridge, and the Japanese launched yet another invasion against China. They swept through Beijing and Shanghai, and then advanced through the Yangtze Valley to China's then capital, Nanking. It was here that saw the worst of Japan's shocking atrocities committed against the Chinese people. Back in Europe, Germany and Italy made their relationship.
Yeah, they refer to that as the rape of Nanking for very good reason. It was horrific what they did to people there. It went on for months and months and months.
Status official by signing the Pact of Steel. Then Hitler turned his eyes towards Poland and the hated Polish corridor, splitting Germany in two. At this point, the Allies really had to put their foot down, and they warned him that an invasion of Poland would mean war. Hitler had planned to continue his advance eastward, but he didn't want to end up fighting a war on two fronts. So for now, he made an alliance with Stalin, saying, "How about we both invade Poland and split it between the two of us, and I definitely won't not refrain from not betraying you sometime in the future." Sounds good. This new alliance stunned the West. On the 1st of September 1939, German troops entered Poland, and Britain and...
Yeah, so with that, so Stalin long believed that there was going to be a war between the Soviets and the West. But with the rise of fascism, now he wasn't sure if it was going to be the capitalist West or the fascist West. So he was just trying to buy time. When Hitler came with this proposal, Stalin was kind of stunned, and he was sort of all over it because now he had time to build things up, because he figured inevitably we were going to be at war with Germany. He didn't trust them. Be at war with somebody, so now he has time to do the things that he wants to do to get the Soviet Union ready for a possible war, and also to do other things like the 5-year plans and all of that. So, of course, Stalin ended up kind of letting his guard down, and that backfired.
France declared war on Germany. The Poles fought hard, but they were no match for the two giants crashing down on them from either side. Then came a period known as the Phony War, where everyone just sort of sat around not doing much. The French had launched a small invasion into the Saarland, but they maintained mostly defensive positions, and after a while decided to just turn around and call it a day. Speaking of France, the French were still super proud of their victory in World War I, and they hadn't really moved on from it. They still used horses, they dispatched messages by motorbike instead of using radio, orders from the commander-in-chief were usually pretty vague, and the troops were rarely inspected. They built a line of defenses along their German border, but didn't bother extending it all the way to the Channel, and they wouldn't launch artillery strikes against Germany out of fear of being retaliated against. In a war, they didn't want to attack the enemy. And at first the UK wasn't much better. Chamberlain still naively hoped that the war could be ended diplomatically. Instead of bombing raids, the RAF dropped propaganda leaflets over German cities, which one air marshal said likely did nothing but provide the continent with toilet paper for the duration of the war. They also only sent 200,000 men to France, while the French had mobilized millions. Both Britain and France wanted to avoid a repeat of the First World War, and so they wanted to keep the war as far from home as possible. So they turned their eyes north, towards Norway. Neutral Sweden was exporting iron ore to Germany through neutral Norway, so the Allies asked them if they could please stop exporting iron ore to Germany, but this request was refused. Then, the Soviet Union attacked Finland, so the Allies said, how about we land troops in Norway and move them across Sweden to go help out your good pal Finland, and along the way maybe take control of all your airfields. But Norway and Sweden still said no. So the UK mined the waters around Norway to force any transport ships into international waters, and they also attacked a German tanker they found in the area. Hitler realized what the Allies were up to, and he quickly moved to secure his supply of iron ore. He launched an invasion through Denmark into Norway. The Allies rushed to land troops at key ports along the coast, but Germany had taken control of Norway's airfield, and their air superiority decided the fight. The Allies had to retreat. After this slightly embarrassing failure, Chamberlain resigned and was replaced with Winston Churchill, who had a slightly different approach to dealing with the Germans. Hitler's overall strategy was similar to Germany's First World War strategy. Attack France, defeat France, knocking out the UK in the process, then turn on the Soviet Union and win the war. During the Phony War, the Allies had given Hitler time to prepare his forces. Now, he was ready to attack. The Allies had wanted to place troops in Belgium, but Belgium had refused, and in a move that surprised pretty much no one, Hitler launched an invasion to get around France's defenses. The Allies charged into Belgium at full speed to meet the German invasion head-on, and it looked like a repeat of the First World War was coming. But this time, Hitler had a trick up his sleeve. Blitzkrieg. As the Germans advanced, they sent thousands of refugees westward, slowing down the Allies. Then, to the south, the French had left the Ardennes, an area full of hills and forests, pretty underdefended because they thought it was naturally impenetrable. Well, the Germans were about to penetrate it with everything they had. They smashed 50 Wehrmacht divisions through and encircled the Allied armies at lightning speed. The best of the Allied forces were now trapped. The Germans squeezed in from all sides, taking out France's best armies and nearly wiping out the British too, but they managed to make a desperate last-minute escape at Dunkirk, with British civilian ships even making the perilous journey to bring their young men home. With most of the French forces depleted,
Yeah, but Dunkirk was really interesting, is that the British had so few ships to have to transport their own troops that they were getting pretty much anyone who owned a sufficiently large boat to do it for them. It was basically a bunch of guys with like fishing boats and yachts. It wasn't really a very well coordinated retreat.
Germans breezed through, taking Paris, and France fell. What the Germans couldn't do in World War I, Hitler had done just like that. Hitler hoped that with the fall of France, the UK would also lose hope and sue for peace, but quite annoyingly, it didn't, and he needed to secure the Western Front, so he tried to force them into submission, with mind games. The UK were now all alone, and Hitler wanted to emphasize that. First of all, just before France fell, Italy finally declared war on the Allies, making the UK's situation even worse. Next, instead of just occupying all of France, Hitler occupied the coastal areas for defense, but allowed France to continue its existence as a German puppet state. This way, it looked like the UK's old ally had decided to switch sides. Hitler also hoped that the UK wouldn't attack any of her old allies' navy bases or colonies in Africa, giving Hitler an extra line of defense to the south. But the UK made sure to respond to this by sailing down to France's navy base in Algeria and wrecking a bunch of ships. So have at it. Hitler then began laying down plans for an invasion of Great Britain. Before German troops could land on British soil, he would first need air and naval superiority across the Channel. Waves of German bombers came, while the completely outnumbered RAF worked bravely around the clock in an attempt to quell the German attacks. At first, the Luftwaffe targeted British ports and coastal facilities. Then it attacked RAF bases, crippling the RAF's ability to defend the nation. And it looked like Hitler's Great British invasion was coming. But then, Churchill ordered a small, pretty insignificant bombing raid over Berlin. It didn't do much damage, but Hitler was furious, and he immediately ordered the Luftwaffe to refocus its attacks on civilian targets in London. Children were sent off to the countryside away from their parents to avoid danger, and frequent trips to air raid shelters became a daily occurrence. But British morale held firm. Smiling, knitting, lounging casually, these people have balls of steel. This refocusing on London also gave the RAF breathing space to reorganize, so Hitler kind of shot himself in the foot there. Just the foot for now. Finally, the Luftwaffe sent one massive all-out attack on London, and the RAF successfully repelled it, destroying many of the German aircraft and placing air superiority firmly in British hands. Hitler's invasion had to be postponed, but the bombing of British cities continued for some time.
Yeah, so that's definitely oversimplified, but it's really good. The fun thing with Mussolini is he did get arrested a lot, in that, you know, he was a war dodger and everything, and turns out to be this militaristic fascist dictator later on. It's kind of funny, but, and like I said, he was a middle school teacher for a while. Imagine having this guy, this, you know, this future fascist leader, and as your school teacher. I can think of a few school teachers that would make good fascist leaders, actually. Quite a few. But anyway, yeah, so the interesting thing about it with Mussolini is that he did craft this whole new ideal, because you know, socialism. So the problem with a lot of the left ideologies that they have faced is around this time especially, is that a lot of them don't agree with each other. You have the socialists, you have the communists, you have syndicalists, many different factions, and they all sort of want a different thing. You know, they'll unite against a common enemy, but once that dust settles, none of them can really figure out what they want. We saw that with the Russian Revolution, where the Bolsheviks kind of swooped in and took over, but there was the Mensheviks and other groups that wanted different things. We kind of see it in Spain too, that they, even though they're losing the war, when it got to the point where they were on the breaking point, they actually started turning on each other too. So that made it much easier for Franco's forces to just come in and sweep the rest of the enemy out of the country. But yeah, so France was 6 weeks from the point of invasion to the point of surrender. 6 weeks. I think Poland was 9 weeks. So the Blitzkrieg was extremely effective in those areas. In Poland, I mean, Poland never stood a chance. They never stood a chance. But France had a good army. They had actually a very good army, and they had arguably better tanks at the time than the early German tanks that were being used at this time. A lot of the planes were on par with the German planes. It was actually very good army, and it was very large. The problem was, like they say, that the head was just terrible. They didn't use radio communications, even amongst, you know, locations. Not just the Germans were using them between tank commanders, and the French weren't even using them from, you know, building to building to over long distances. So they were still using telegraphs on a lot of things. They weren't even using radios. If it was too far for someone to just ride, they would use a telegraph. And a lot of their leaders were old and just not up on new strategies. They were resistant to new things, whereas Germany had sort of been forced to completely reevaluate everything from the ground up. The French didn't have to do that. At least they didn't think they had to do that. So they didn't. A lot of these older commanders had just old ideas that they were not ready to budge from. And then the government itself was not very stable. So it wasn't a dire situation, but there was definitely a lot of unrest. There was a lot of pro-communist and pro-socialist groups within France. I think the largest one was the communist group. And then there was a pro-fascist group too. So, and both of them are sort of trying to get power in France, and both of them are doing pretty good at getting a lot of people on their side. It's kind of argued that if World War II had not happened, France may have wound up in a civil war or some form of revolution because of the instability politically, that it may have continued down the path and it would have been like another Spain. Yeah, it's been interesting to see the rise of fascism, because they really just promised a lot of things. They promised stability, they promised jobs, they promised all sorts of things. And what made them successful is that they delivered. It wasn't just false promises. So many times in history, and even present day, politicians come and they promise this, that, and the other thing to get elected or to take power through whatever means, and then they don't really deliver. Mussolini delivered. I mean, he did. He didn't rebuild the Roman Empire like he said, but he delivered on a lot of things. He brought job and he brought stability and he brought a lot of respect to Italy and everything. So, and he rebuilt the military and all these things. So many things that he promised, and Hitler the same way. He rebuilt the military. He took back lost lands. He brought jobs. He brought economic stability. He did most of what he promised to do. He did do, at least in peacetime, and then even during wartime, a lot of what he promised to do, he did do at least for a while, until everything started to come apart. So that's a really interesting thing with them. And that's why they're to take power. So, and hold power, because sometimes it's like, well, why didn't people just kind of rebel, mass rebellions against these leaders? But they were successful when they started, and then just the massive propaganda and brainwashing campaigns that go on while they're in power. By the time things start to not go well, people are pretty indoctrinated. Now in Italy, they broke through that pretty quickly because Mussolini was not as good at controlling his masses the way Hitler was. He didn't really win everyone over quite the same way as Hitler had everyone so indoctrinated that, old men and children were fighting in the streets for him at the end of the war. But it was crazy. I mean, Hitler was also a little more brutal than Mussolini. Mussolini was, don't get me wrong, the fascists in Italy were brutal. They needed to be, but the Nazis were much, much worse. They would just, if you said no, they just shot you. Whereas Mussolini would have you arrested and thrown into a cell. So it's kind of like, it's bad, but at least they're not shooting you in front of your family. There are levels of bad. Being arrested in front of your children is one thing. Being shot in front of your children is a different thing. So they both suck, but one's a lot worse. And then, the rise of fascism in Japan, too. That sort of came on a different path. It wasn't as much about stability with Japan. It was just Japan felt like it had to take its rightful place in the sun. That it had fought in World War One and gotten very little for it against a bunch of islands that Germany had, but hadn't really gotten a lot. It had attacked China, like it said, and then Europe just kind of came in and took everything that Japan was going to take, and they couldn't fight it back, so they just let it happen. And then they beat the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War, and everyone was shocked, but they still didn't get any respect. So they're just like, we want to be respected, we want to be treated fairly, we want our place in the sun, we want to build our own empire that everyone will respect. So that was Japan's position. I just laugh at Chamberlain, though, because he was just such an ineffective leader. Not domestically, he was a great leader. Foreign policy, he was terrible. He thought he could negotiate with anyone, and Hitler was not someone you could negotiate with, because Hitler didn't care. He was going to do whatever he wanted anyways. But he was just stunned that Hitler broke his word. He was absolutely stunned, and everyone was kind of like, really? You're surprised? Really? Because France kind of figured that he was going to break his word. France kind of figured he would. They were buying time. France. They didn't trust Hitler at all. It's like with Stalin signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. He was just buying time. It bought him time, and of course he would not use that time wisely and suffer badly when they do invade. But the plan was to buy time. That if Hitler was offering you time, you took it. Although the other side of that is that Hitler also has that time, so he is building his own forces, and he is doing what he wants to do. So he's beating the Western Front and then coming after Soviets, and it's a precarious position because on the one hand, you buy time to strengthen yourself, and if you actually effectively do that, Stalin, then you would be able to repel an invasion, Stalin. But on the other hand, if you don't, then you wind up at war now or very soon. but you also take them off of the position they want to be in. But they may already be in a position to attack you. Like they already know that no is an answer, so they're already in a position to attack you. So if you're really not ready for a war, you're kind of in trouble. So you gotta take it. Stalin. I'm just gonna keep saying that because guy, he gave you like, what was it, 2-3 years? Stalin. But anyway, so I will be doing part 2 of this series of this video very soon. I have it right here. I'll probably just do it now and release it later. I do love these. I will be returning to the Napoleon series by Epic History TV real soon. I'm going to do one of the Russian ones first, then I'm going to return to Napoleon, because I really, really enjoy that series. But I did do the Epic History TV 1917 Russian Revolution, and that was very interesting. So I have already done one of the Russian ones. It doesn't fit into the same forge as the others, but it is a Russian history one, so that one's very interesting. So you can check that out. I'll leave the link up here somewhere. And also check out the Napoleon ones, because I've done 4 of them so far, and I will be doing more. Absolutely, I'll be doing the entirety of it, and I'll be doing more Oversimplified in the near future. We're going to end the video there. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. And if you have any other videos you want me to check out, whether history or alternative history, put them in the comment section, and I'll be sure to check them out. And I will see you next time.